There are moments when official language begins to lose its balance, not in tone, not in volume, but in timing. Statements appear too quickly after incidents. Military movements coincide too precisely with diplomatic reassurances. And what should look like routine coordination starts to resemble synchronization. That shift does not announce itself. It settles quietly into the background, almost procedural, and yet it changes the atmosphere entirely. The meeting in Washington was presented as structured, strategic, contained. Discussions centered on prevention, on safeguards, on ensuring that certain thresholds are never crossed. The language was careful, conditional, options remain open, diplomacy remains active, military readiness remains standard, nothing extraordinary. And yet, within the same week, an American carrier operating hundreds of miles from Iran's coastline engaged and destroyed an approaching drone after repeated warnings were ignored. The official explanation described de-escalation measures, defensive response, protection of personnel, all technically accurate. But something in the sequence deserves closer attention. A reconnaissance drone does not simply drift toward a carrier group by accident. It moves with purpose. It transmits data. It tests response times. And when it continues forward after warnings, that continuation carries meaning, especially when, hours later, a separate incident unfolds in the Strait of Hormuz involving fast boats and a commercial vessel under U.S. protection. Two pressure points activated within the same operational window, not loud enough to constitute war, not small enough to dismiss. It seems insignificant until you connect the sequence. At the same time, preparations elsewhere accelerate. A second carrier strike group completes exercises and receives instructions to remain ready for immediate deployment. No announcement of departure, no formal escalation, just readiness. Fueling cycles adjusted, training compressed, timelines shortened. When readiness shifts from contingency to immediacy, it usually reflects calculations that have already been made behind closed doors. The public message remains balanced. Negotiations continue, diplomatic channels remain open, but references to previous operations surface unexpectedly in presidential remarks. Historical strikes are mentioned not as distant memory, but as precedent. And this is where the main thing begins. Because precedent in this context is not rhetorical, it is operational. Meanwhile, Tehran reiterates that its missile capabilities are not subject to negotiation. That point is delivered without theatrics. Simply stated as structural fact, defensive doctrine remains intact. Yet satellite imagery shows accelerated work at certain facilities while others receive minimal attention. Repairs focus on launch infrastructure more than symbolic targets. This distinction is rarely discussed openly. It suggests prioritization. Additional American aircraft reposition quietly across regional bases. Stealth platforms transit through Europe toward Jordan. Electronic warfare units remain on rotation. Destroyers extend patrol cycles. Each individual movement can be justified. Each deployment has its own explanation. But when viewed collectively, the architecture begins to resemble something more than precaution. At this point, the system usually shows its limits, because maintaining simultaneous diplomacy and visible strike capacity requires precise balance. Too much force signals intent, too little signals weakness. The margin narrows. Iran conducts limited maritime maneuvers, then cancels live fire exercises after receiving warnings. Days later, a drone approaches a carrier anyway. Was that defiance or recalibration? The answer depends on what data was collected before contact was lost. It depends on what images were transmitted back. It depends on what conclusions were drawn in rooms we do not see. Two carriers in the same theater is not symbolic. It alters operational geometry. It expands strike options while preserving defensive layers. It allows simultaneous axes of pressure. That configuration is rarely assembled without purpose, and yet no formal declaration accompanies it. No ultimatum, no mobilization speech, only readiness. The public narrative insists this is about preventing escalation, about ensuring that certain capabilities never materialize. But prevention sometimes requires proximity, and proximity carries risk, especially in waters where warning shots are replaced by live interceptions within seconds. There is also the matter of timing. The second carrier preparation order surfaces immediately after high-level talks conclude without visible agreement. The drone incident occurs on the same day. The language from both capitals grows sharper but remains measured. The choreography feels deliberate. So the question becomes less about whether negotiations continue and more about how long a dual-track posture can be sustained before one track overrides the other. Because history shows that when military assets accumulate beyond deterrence thresholds, the logic shifts. Commanders begin calculating windows rather than probabilities. Nothing has formally changed. No strike has been authorized. No ultimatum has expired. And yet, in the Arabian Sea, tonnage increases. Aircraft numbers rise. Patrol patterns adjust. Warnings grow shorter. It is not the volume of statements that matters. It is the density of preparation. And at a certain density, systems stop rehearsing and begin positioning. That threshold has not been announced. But the geometry now in place suggests it may already be closer than either side publicly admits. The geometry in place is not accidental. Once two carrier strike groups operate within the same theater, the conversation shifts from signaling to sequencing. A single carrier can deter. Two carriers create redundancy. Redundancy allows sustained operations without exposing vulnerability during refueling cycles, maintenance rotations, or air wing recovery windows. That is not symbolism. That is structure. With one group positioned several hundred miles from Iran's southern coastline and a second prepared to enter the same operational envelope, planners gain the ability to divide missions. One axis can suppress air defenses and missile infrastructure. The other can maintain maritime control over the Strait of Hormuz and shield regional bases. Simultaneous pressure from multiple directions compresses reaction time. It forces defensive systems to split radar coverage, interceptor allocation, and command bandwidth. Iran's doctrine has long depended on concentrating response at a single vector. Two vectors strain that model immediately. The drone incident in this context becomes less about provocation and more about calibration. A reconnaissance platform that transmits imagery before destruction provides targeting refinement. It measures radar activation sequences. It observes aircraft launch tempo. It records electronic signatures. Even in loss, it gathers data. But the interception itself also feeds American systems with telemetry. Every approach, every maneuver, every emission from Iranian platforms becomes part of a predictive matrix. Both sides collect. Both sides update. That reciprocal observation accelerates contingency planning. When additional F-35 squadrons reposition to regional bases, they do not arrive merely to increase numbers. They integrate into a layered strike architecture. Stealth platforms suppress integrated air defenses. Electronic warfare aircraft degrade communication nodes. Land-based F-15 units carry heavier ordnance for follow-on strikes. Subsurface assets extend reach without surface exposure. The structure resembles a rehearsed configuration rather than an improvised buildup. And configurations of that scale require synchronized logistics weeks in advance. Meanwhile, diplomatic language continues. Negotiations remain formally active. That dual posture serves a purpose. It preserves legitimacy while compressing decision time. If talks collapse, assets are already positioned. If talks progress, pressure can be gradually reduced without public retreat. The system keeps both doors operational, but the longer this configuration persists, the more expensive it becomes to maintain without outcome. Iran's emphasis on missile capability reflects recognition of this imbalance. Underground launch sites, mobile platforms, and regional-based targeting are designed to impose cost on any initiating strike. The logic is straightforward: increase perceived retaliation risk beyond acceptable threshold. Yet the introduction of a second carrier complicates that deterrent equation. Defensive interceptors, Aegis destroyers, and airborne early warning platforms expand protective coverage. Two carriers reduce the probability that a single retaliatory volley could significantly degrade U.S. capacity. The deterrence window narrows. This is where internal timelines matter. Military assets do not remain in heightened readiness indefinitely without political decision. Fuel cycles, crew fatigue, maintenance intervals, these are not abstract constraints. They create pressure for clarity. Either posture transitions back to routine or it converts into execution. Sustained ambiguity erodes efficiency. The regional layer adds further compression. Gulf bases lie within range of Iranian ballistic systems. Previous exchanges demonstrated that retaliatory strikes can occur rapidly after initial engagement, but repetition changes calculation. Once prior thresholds have been crossed, subsequent responses escalate faster. Commanders shorten deliberation cycles. Warning periods shrink. In such environments, misinterpretation requires only seconds. The meeting in Washington, therefore, should not be viewed in isolation. High-level consultations immediately preceding force augmentation suggest alignment rather than coincidence. If negotiations were expected to produce immediate breakthrough, such parallel reinforcement would be strategically unnecessary. Reinforcement signals, contingency planning for failure. None of this confirms that an order has been signed. It confirms that infrastructure for execution is present. 2 carriers, multiple destroyers, stealth aircraft across dispersed bases, electronic warfare coverage, submarine capacity. This is a comprehensive strike envelope. When such an envelope forms, it does not dissipate casually. It either fulfills its deterrent function quickly or it is tested. The critical variable is decision latency. How long can both sides continue controlled probing without triggering automatic escalation protocols embedded in their command systems? Each drone approach, each maritime maneuver, each intercepted transmission increases friction. Friction increases probability of unintended sequence activation. There is no formal declaration of pre-strike status. There is no visible countdown, but operational density now exceeds routine deterrence posture. That density generates its own momentum. Systems configured for execution tend to search for resolution. And once resolution becomes the only efficient path, diplomacy loses the space it requires to function. There is another dimension rarely discussed openly: the tempo of command authorization. When force concentration reaches a certain threshold, authority often pre-delegates response parameters to theater commanders. That reduces reaction time from hours to minutes. It also narrows the space for political recalibration once an incident occurs. In highly saturated environments, automated defense systems interpret trajectories before diplomats interpret language. That asymmetry is structural. Consider also the maritime insurance markets. Premium adjustments often precede public acknowledgement of risk escalation. When underwriters quietly raise rates for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, it reflects private assessments that differ from public assurances. Financial systems react to probability curves long before official communiques admit instability. The invisible layer of economic friction becomes an early indicator of operational expectation. Satellite traffic patterns provide another signal. Commercial imaging firms report unusual spikes in tasking requests over specific grid sectors along Iran's southern corridor. Increased demand for high-resolution imagery suggests that analysts are refining target packages or verifying infrastructure changes in near real time. Such activity does not confirm intent, but it reflects preparation depth. Then there is the cyber domain. During periods of visible military buildup, offensive cyber operations often expand quietly. Network probing intensifies. Critical infrastructure mapping accelerates. Power grids, communication backbones, air defense data links all become part of the same integrated battle space. Modern strike doctrine does not begin with kinetic impact. It begins with digital disruption calibrated to precede it by seconds or minutes. That layer remains largely invisible to the public narrative. Regional actors are adjusting as well. Gulf states increase air defense readiness without public commentary. Intelligence sharing channels operate at higher throughput. Even air traffic routing subtly shifts to avoid projected engagement zones. None of this appears dramatic, but collectively it signals expectation management. What makes the present configuration uniquely sensitive is the compression of geography. The Persian Gulf does not offer depth for maneuver once hostilities begin. Distances between naval assets, missile launch points, and civilian shipping lanes are measured in minutes of flight time. In such confined space, escalation curves steepen rapidly. Defensive intercepts can be misread as offensive launches. Electronic jamming can resemble preparatory strike suppression. The difference between rehearsal and execution becomes indistinguishable under radar saturation. It is also worth noting that domestic political calendars influence strategic patience. Electoral cycles, legislative sessions, budget deadlines, these factors alter risk tolerance in ways rarely acknowledged in strategic briefings. When domestic pressure converges with external friction, leaders may perceive decisive action as stabilizing rather than destabilizing. That psychological shift often precedes operational authorization. And when military structures reach that point of self-imposed logic, history shows they rarely remain idle indefinitely.